for the sake of this place and the people who would serve it, to stop this absolute farce from continuing.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill is rising on a point of order.
On the same point of order, Chair. Chair, for what it's worth, I do think that you may have a point on perhaps not reiterating the entirety of the allegations which have been reported to the CBC. However, I would ask that you understand that these are material to the case that are about to be made. So perhaps what could be done here, I am not a member of the Board of Internal Economy. I would like to speak to this point of privilege from perhaps a different angle than my colleague will, but I do think that it is important that you hear him speak to what he believes the breach of privilege is. This is the time to do it at the start of this Parliament. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely aware, personally, of the ramifications that I might have in my role of questioning someone in a position of power, such as the person that we are discussing. Okay? I understand what that might mean for me, given the import of his role in the House of Commons. I would not be doing this lightly if I did not feel it material to the functioning of the House going forward. So I would ask you respectfully to allow my colleague to continue. I would perhaps strongly agree with you, with my colleague, that he keeps his arguments tight to the matter at hand, only referring to the allegations and making the assumption that you will know them, but that we are allowed to make the case of privilege. Thank you, Chair.
If I could, these are allegations, and the facts should be found and they should be discovered. I would be very happy to put this, as the chair of the Board of Internal Economy, on the agenda to be dealt with the right process. Is something I would be very comfortable with. Debating it in an open chamber like this is not the right place. And that is my view of it. And we have the whip of the opposition who is on the Board of Internal Economy. I'll recognize him, the honourable member for Banff Airdrie, if he has something to add to that, if he agrees with me.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I still think that it is important that the member, and I would agree that it's probably best that he gets to what he sees as the breach of privilege. I think it is important, and it should be important that he gets an opportunity to lay out the facts, and perhaps that will happen at a later date should you find a prima facie case. But I think it is important that you do hear what he sees as the breach of privilege here before you make a ruling. I think that is critically important, that you give the opportunity for him to do that concisely and quickly, what he sees as the breach of privilege, because I think that is important before you make a ruling, Mr. Speaker.
Phil, keep it very concise, to the point, and please do not bring up allegations that have not been proven. We're talking a personnel issue, and if personnel issues are dealt with, they need to be dealt with in the Board of Internal Economy as an item normally in camera, because it involves personnel. Most big corporations or private corporations, small companies, do not discuss personnel issues out in public. And I honestly feel very strongly about this. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil. I'll let him continue. Again, you've got a very quick point to make, and like I said, you have my word. It will go to the Board of Internal Economy as part of the agenda and be dealt with in the right process.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I continue, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to table copies of the relevant PCO documents which were disclosed through access to information. I'd like unanimous consent for that, please.
Have unanimous consent? I'm afraid we don't have unanimous consent. Okay, the honourable member for Barrie Innisfil, I'll let him continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And and I will say, without laying out properly the facts of this case as we know them, it's awfully difficult to present a prima facie case. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, that there has regrettably been a cloud placed upon the House administration, and it certainly has given Conservatives pause to reflect on what extent we can collaborate. In fact, the same paranoia is, as we've seen, among House officials themselves. So in my view, the House could and should refer this whole mess to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee for full and proper investigation. And as much as some of the reactions to the media have referred to some secret external review, it has been completely uncontested in the reporting that this review never considered any of the partisanship revelations which have come to light. And to that end, Mr. Speaker, we should bear in mind the words of Mr. Speaker Milliken's February 1st, 2002 ruling at page 8582 of the debates, where he said, quote, "In view of the gravity of the matter, I have concluded that the situation before us, where the House is left with two versions of events, is one that merits further consideration by an appropriate committee, if only to clear the air." Surely, and it appears that perhaps one side is not aligned with this, all sides should agree that the air needs to be cleared here. And that's why Conservatives last week asked for the Liberals to release all correspondence and records they have with the clerk so that we can see whether the allegations are true or just how big that pipeline is. And yet the Liberals have not been forthcoming to this point, which speaks volumes, frankly. And that's why stronger tools are now needed to be able to clear the air. A parliamentary committee is a strong vehicle to do just that, as Mr. Speaker Milliken ruled on October 15th, 2001 at page 6085 of the debates. Quote, "There is a body that is well equipped to commit acts of inquisition, and that is the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, which has a fearsome chairman, quite able to extract information from witnesses who appear before the committee with the aid of capable members who form the committee of the House," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the House must stand up for its own dignity and self-respect. If you find a prima facie case of privilege, I am prepared, as I said earlier, to move the appropriate motion for a committee study. That is the only way, I'm afraid, that the cloud can be cleared and these foundation-shaking allegations either can be confirmed or purged so that we can get to the real business of Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean on a point of order. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. I would refer, as you did, to the comments from the member of Calgary Nose Hill. She talked about people working on the Hill and knowing that those people chose to serve democracy. They deserve to have a safe workplace without any inappropriate behavior or harassment. They have the right. But when on the question of privilege, we also owe this to ourselves because they're the ones who support our work as parliamentarians. They're the ones who support our privileges, and that's what the issue is all about. So we are of the view that the Board of Internal Economy should investigate. We have to assess whether steps were taken to punish people who were complained about. That is the mission and the jurisdiction of the Board of Internal Economy under the Parliamentary Employment Staff Relations Act, the Parliament Act, and the standing orders. The Board of Internal Inquiry has to investigate and report. That's the only way we can ensure that the responsible authorities, in this case, the Privy Council, the Prime Minister himself, and the Speaker of the House, you, Mr. Speaker, that's the only way we can ensure that the proper steps were taken and taken promptly. This is the only way is if the board reports to us how these complaints were handled and how this inappropriate behavior was stopped, and ultimately how those responsible are or were punished. We want the board to be mandated to investigate and report back to the House as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to remove this microphone from my collar. I would like to add to my colleague's argument with additional evidence, not allegations, but additional rationale. And I'd like to argue that the Board of Internal Economy is not, in fact, the place to have this happen. Adding to my colleague from Barrie Innisfail's argument, I would argue that my privilege as a member has been breached here because it is arguably not safe to work here. The allegations which have surfaced could be put into two silos. There's other silos, but the ones that I want to address. First of all, that there is a toxic workplace culture in House administration, and there was no appropriate vehicle by which to air that problem and have appropriate human resources actions taken. That is very clear by the CBC report. Given that, moving that review into private under the auspices of the person by which the allegations are leveled is completely inappropriate by any human resources standard. The process that we would have to deal with in a circumstance like this, Speaker, respectfully, would be PROC or referred to a committee for study. The second piece, the second silo that I would argue in terms of it not being safe to work here is that there were serious allegations that came to light about a former staff member against a former member of Parliament, wherein she stated in reports that House administration steered her towards mediation when she felt that a full complaint was warranted. And that flies directly in the face of the Board of Internal Economy's policy on workplace harassment. In fact, you can find it on page 12. House administration should never have steered a complainant towards an example. Now, given the fact that there are allegations of toxic workplace culture within House administration that the Human Resources Department is part of.
Speaker, point of order.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Is this what we're doing, Mr. Speaker? Are we hearing evidence on this case? I'm hearing the member opposite posit as fact a number of different items that she's stating as fact. That again, there is no opportunity to respond to or see other evidence of. And is this what we're doing? I just want to understand what your ruling is in this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Come back to the House with a ruling. If I could, I think I've made a commitment to bring this to the Board of Internal Economy, to get down to the bottom of it, one way or another. I think that's a fair offer. If I can bring that to the board, find out what's going on, and then come back with a ruling before that. I just need some time to process it. We've got points of orders popping up all over. Okay, we'll go to the honourable member for Banff Airdrie, then we'll come back to Calgary Nose Hill.
And I appreciate that, and I know that your intentions here are good, that you're looking to try to find a way to look at the matter to resolve it, and that is appreciated, Mr. Speaker. I know that's important to you as well. But what the member is trying to do, if what I'm hearing is right, what I hear her trying to do is she's trying to make the arguments and make the case that she believes there is another avenue at which this should be taken down. I do think it's important for you, before making a ruling, to hear her out, to hear why it is that she believes that there is a different avenue that should be taken. So I do think we should give her. I hope she doesn't intend to be at great lengths, but I think it's important that we do hear her and her arguments for why another avenue is the better alternative, because I think that is important that you hear that before making a ruling.
Calgary Nose Hill, if she can make her point, and then what I'll do is I'll take it into deliberation and come back to the House with a ruling. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I do not feel that the Board of Internal Economy, which is largely a closed-door process, is appropriate to deal with the breach of privilege that I am raising today. Is that my privilege is breached because it is not safe to work here by virtue of other people not finding it safe to work here. And frankly, I have raised this issue in numerous forums over the entirety of my decade in this place. a decade into working here, I still don't feel like it's safe to work here. And I don't think that, with respect, Speaker, shunting this issue into a closed-door committee when there are people at home who have not had justice is appropriate. I can't stress this enough. Mr. Speaker, I would argue to you that should an open-door process find it appropriate to review personnel decisions or new processes in the House administration through the Board of Internal Economy, that's the route we should take. But at this point in time, be it within political parties of all stripes on this place, but certainly now within the House itself, like there's no assurances for anybody coming forward with harassment that this is going to be taken seriously, okay? So this has to be done not in a closed-door committee, but in an appropriate parliamentary committee. That is the only way this is going to be addressed, Speaker. My privilege and all of our privileges are breached because we're doing the emotional labor of dealing with unwanted touching, sexual harassment, and workplace harassment instead of doing our jobs. And that is the definition of privilege being breached, okay? It has to be done outside of the Board of Internal Economy, and light has to be shone on this. I'm not saying this out of I don't want to be doing this. I want to be talking about other things today, but I'm tired of this. So on the 100th anniversary of women being elected in Parliament, don't shunt this to a closed-door committee. Put it out in public. I beg of you. Please.
I want to thank the honourable member for her argument, and I will take that definitely under consideration and return to the House with a ruling. I'm sorry, the honourable member for Westminster Burnaby.
New Westminster Burnaby, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We, too, feel that this is a very serious topic, as you mentioned earlier. And we're talking about human resources issues, about how our employees are being treated. And we also are talking about impartiality in the House of Commons. These are all things that are very serious issues. And there are some serious allegations at play here, too. And we feel that the Board of Internal Economy is the best placed to deal with these important questions. We know that you're aware of that, Mr. Speaker. You already indicated that you were taking this very seriously. So I think all members agree that this is very serious. Now, the best avenue, in our view, of course, is the board. The board is a committee that is tasked with dealing with human resources issues.
It's allegations. They need to be treated seriously. And we believe the Bureau of Internal Economy, the Board of Internal Economy, is the right place to have those discussions that must surely follow the interventions today. Thank you.
I want to thank the honourable members. I think what we're hearing is partially process and what is going on with from the honourable member from Calgary Nose Hill, which has one implication, and the other one is on a particular case. If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind taking some time and going over this and returning with a judgment at some point in hopefully the next week. It's something that takes a lot of time and consideration so that we do the right thing and not go in the wrong direction and have the wrong allegations or facts twisted so that we end up in the wrong place. And all of us want this place to be safe. And sexual harassment is something we take very seriously on this Hill. Thank you. Is that for something new? The honourable member for Banff Airdrie?
It's a different question.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising on a point of privilege as well. First of all, as this is my first time rising, not on a point of order at least, in this Parliament, just to congratulate you, Mr. Speaker, on your election as Speaker. And I know that you'll, as you did in the last Parliament, face a number of challenges that will come up, and I know that you will handle them with the same tact and grace and dignity that you always have. And certainly from this side of the House, congratulations on your continuing role as in the chair. I also want to express my appreciation to the voters of Banff Airdrie for giving me another opportunity to represent them in this place. It's always, no matter how many times you're elected to serve, it's always an immense honor. Now, as you know, Mr. Speaker, from the notice that I have sent you about this point of privilege, I'm rising on a question of privilege that relates to the decision of the Board of Internal Economy that was announced on the evening of October 19th. And I'll quote that decision. That the Speaker of the House of Commons and Chair of the Board of Internal Economy reports that the Board has determined that effective Monday, November 22nd of 2021, individuals must be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 to be allowed within the House of Commons precinct. This requirement will apply to any person who wishes to enter the House of Commons precinct, including members. End quote. Now, in media comments the following day, I said that Conservatives couldn't agree to 7 members of Parliament, which would be referring to non-Conservative members of the Board, meeting in secret and deciding which of the 338 members of this House who had just been elected by Canadians, who of those 338 members could enter this chamber to represent their constituents. You will recall that once upon a time, the Liberals were boasting about the Board of Internal Economy meetings being open by default. And they were talking about all this great transparency and et cetera, that they were going to bring there. Instead, we ended up getting, in this case, a decision that has what I would say is very sweeping constitutional implications, being made behind the closed doors and with a very vague agenda heading of legal employment matters, which frankly could have meant practically anything to anyone who was looking at it on the Board's website. And because that Board meeting was held in camera, you'll appreciate that I'll be taking caution in what I say about those deliberations, of course. But one of the traditions of the Board is that it operates on a consensus basis. And votes there are, in fact, very rare. I think there have been not even a handful of them in the past decade or two. And there's a lot of good reasons for consensus-making decisions at the Board. And that model is important there. And not the least of which is that when a decision is made, every member of the Board can then go back to his or her caucus and simply explain the decision without having to betray the in-camera discussions that took place there. And I will say that the opposition House Leader and I abstained from the vote on that Board decision, given that we believed that the Board lacked the jurisdiction to be able to limit members' access to the parliamentary proceedings. And it's that lack of jurisdiction which I'm challenging here today by way of this question of privilege, Mr. Speaker.
Government House Leader.
Economy are in camera, and therefore discussions about votes inside of the Board of Internal Economy are supposed to also be similarly in camera.
Well, member for Banff Airdrie. So I'm sorry.
In response to his point of order.
Yes, the honourable member for. I'm sorry.
The government House Leader has been on his feet several times. Just because he doesn't like what opposition members are saying, it doesn't mean it's not fair. And the fact the member from Banff Airdrie made the point of he wouldn't discuss anything that was in camera at the Board of Internal Economies. So I think he should be able to continue with his remarks.
I don't want to get involved in the debate, but I'll be honest with you. I had just called up the clerk, and I was about to ask him that question: if reporting on a vote and how people voted in camera was a breach. But I'll let the honourable member continue, and I'll consult with and I'll listen in and see where everything's going. That was my question.
I was not attempting to reveal the votes of other members. I simply was indicating that I abstained from the vote. If you've indicated I can continue, so I thank you for that, Mr. Speaker. But don't get me, I want to make one thing really clear right now. This question of privilege doesn't relate in any way to disputing vaccines or their very vital role in conquering the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'm challenging is the authority of the board.
I just did consult with the clerk in the meantime, and it's a fine line But basically, what the honourable member, the honourable member for the whip for the Conservative Party, the member for Banff Airdrie, is saying is that he didn't vote. That's basically all he's saying. So, I mean, there's a fine line there between saying what happened in the House and or in the board and what didn't happen. So basically, I just want to caution everyone that what had gone on, was in camera, and just please keep that in mind. The honourable member for Banff Airdrie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I respect that. And I, as I've indicated, I will be cautious about that. But again, what I want to make clear is that what I'm questioning here is the jurisdiction of the board to be able to make that decision, and not the fact that the decision, because I do believe that that the role the role of vaccines and vaccinations in conquering COVID-19 is critically important. And we've said that as Conservatives for the entire time, that vaccines are in fact the safest and most effective way to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and to prevent serious illness. And we encourage every Canadian who can to get vaccinated, because vaccines are our ticket out of this wretched pandemic. And I want to make that very clear. That's why we've been so persistent in critiquing the government's efforts in terms of procurement of vaccines, and why we were urging the Liberals to ensure that more Canadians had access to get their jabs in their arms sooner. But unlike the Prime Minister, who I would say should be ashamed of himself for politicizing vaccines and dividing Canadians, Conservatives have abided by all of the public health guidelines during the recent election campaign, and it's also why the Leader of the Opposition announced.
To clarify with the honourable member, we're getting into a debate here. I just want the facts of the case on where we're going to. If I could just ask him to stick to that, I would appreciate it. The honourable member for Banff Airdrie.
And I guess it's important to establish what it isn't about as much as it is important to establish what it is about. So I understand, I take the point, and I'll move on. I think I've made the point that what it isn't about. It certainly isn't about the efficacy or the importance of vaccines. I'll make that clear. But what I am rising about today is because I believe that the Board of Internal Economy decision represents a major breach of the ancient privileges of this House, and in fact could set a very troublesome precedent. Some pundits, following the Prime Minister's lead, have been quick to claim that this issue is about some politicians looking out for their own self-interests. But as pages 59 and 60 of the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, reminds us, and I quote, "The privileges of the Commons are designed to safeguard the rights of each and every elector," end quote. And that's critically important, because those electors that refers to, barely 2 months ago, chose 338 people that sit in this House to represent them here in the House of Commons. And then later on page 60, Boskin Gagnon, the quote from the 20th edition of Erskine May's Parliamentary Procedure, and I'll quote, "The privileges of Parliament are rights which are absolutely necessary for the due execution of its powers. They are enjoyed by individual members because the House cannot perform its functions without unimpeded use of the services of its members," end quote. A similar point is made by Joseph Manjot at page 12 of his 2nd edition of Parliamentary Privilege in Canada. The privileges which are implicated by the Board's decision are in fact to be found among the House's collective rights. In particular, I'd point the Chair to page 59 of Boskin Gagnon, which explains that, and I quote, "The rights and powers of the House as a collectivity may be categorized as follows: exclusive right to regulate its own internal affairs, including its debates, proceedings, and facilities, and the right to provide for its proper constitution, including the authority to maintain the attendance and service of its members," end quote. This right of the House to maintain the attendance and to have the service of its members finds expression in Standing Order 15, which I'll quote from. "Every member, being cognizant of the provisions of the Parliament of Canada Act, is bound to attend the sittings of the House, unless otherwise occupied with parliamentary activities and functions or on public or official business," end quote. Now let me underscore that, Mr. Speaker. Every member is bound to attend the sittings of the House. Some exceptions are, as I said, indeed noted, but none of them suggest that this expectation can be waived off by the Board of Internal Economy. Boskin Gagnon at page 107 state, and I quote, in order to fulfill their parliamentary duties, members should be able to go about their parliamentary business undisturbed. Speakers have consistently upheld the right of the House to the services of its members, free from intimidation, obstruction, and interference." End quote. The Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, in its 66th report presented in April of 1999, elaborated at paragraph 15, and I quote again, "One of the privileges of members of the House of Commons is a right of unimpeded access to Parliament and the parliamentary precincts. Members are entitled to go about their parliamentary business undisturbed and cannot be prevented from entering the chamber or a committee room for a parliamentary proceeding. This privilege can be traced back to at least the early 18th century, and as part of the tradition and heritage, or pardon me, part of the heritage of all legislative bodies that trace their origins to the British parliamentary tradition. It is based on the preeminent right of the House to the attendance and service of its members. Any obstruction of members constitutes a breach of privilege and a contempt of the House of Commons." End quote. There can be no doubt that the board's decision constitutes or purports to be an obstruction of members to this House and their ability to come here for its sittings. And once our committees get struck, potentially meetings of those committees as well. And that leads me to the comments of Boskin Gagnon at page 110, and I quote, "In circumstances where members claim to be physically obstructed, impeded, interfered with, or intimidated in the performance of their parliamentary functions, the Speaker is apt to find that a prima facie breach of privilege has occurred. Incidents involving physical obstruction, either impeding members' access to the parliamentary precinct or blocking their free movement within the precinct, have been found to be prima facie cases of privilege." End quote. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, Boskin Gagnon at page 86 remind us that, and I quote, "The denial of access of members to the parliamentary precinct has been found to constitute contempt of the House on several occasions." End quote. While those incidents typically relate to security activities or maybe organized protests, for example, the occasions afforded the Procedure and House Affairs Committee several different opportunities to shed light on how critical these rights of the House actually are. The committee, for example, wrote in its 21st report, tabled in January of 2005, and I quote, the denial of access to members of the House, even if temporary, is unacceptable and constitutes a contempt of the House. Members must not be impeded or interfered with while on their way to the chamber or when going about their parliamentary business. To permit this would interfere with the operation of the House of Commons and undermine the preeminent right of the House to the services of its members. End quote. That report was subsequently concurred in by the House on May the 17th of 2005. The Procedure and House Affairs Committee later wrote, this time in its 26th report, tabled in May of 2012, and I quote, "As part of the parliamentary privilege, members of the House of Commons have the right of unimpeded and unfettered access to the parliamentary precincts and are entitled to go about their parliamentary duties and functions undisturbed and without any form of interference." End quote. The same point was made almost word for word by the committee in its 34th report, presented in March of 2015, and in another 34th report, this time presented in June of 2017. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'd pause to observe that I was actually a member of the committee for both of those reports. And it was clear to me from my participation during those committee deliberations that there was a growing impatience in the parliamentary community with members being thwarted in their efforts to come to the House. That's why I was so surprised to see only a few years later at the Board of Internal Economy such a casual approach taken to imposing barriers without sufficient accommodations on MPs being able to come to the chamber. The earlier attitudes that I spoke of can be found, for example, in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee's 2012 report, which restated the obligations and expectations of those regulating access to Parliament, including this observation, and I quote, "First, members of the House of Commons should not be, in any case, denied or delayed access to the Hill and the precinct when they are known to be members." End quote. And Mr. Speaker Reagan, in an April 6, 2017 ruling, which would eventually lead to the 2017 report that I cited just a minute ago, commented at page 10246 of the debates, and I quote, "The importance of the matter of members' access to the precinct particularly when there are votes for members to attend, cannot be overstated. It bears repeating that even a temporary denial of access, whether there is a vote or not, cannot be tolerated. End quote. The 2017 report, meanwhile, noted, and I quote again, in line with past precedents, the committee strongly believes that the right of unimpeded access for parliamentarians to the parliamentary precinct is of the utmost importance, and that obstruction or interference with members engaged in parliamentary business cannot be condoned. End quote. So we are left there, Mr. Speaker, with a trail of precedents, which goes directly to the right of this House to have the attendance and service of its members. Now, some may say that the board's decision should be upheld because it's about safety. And I agree that in pandemic times it is right that we should take appropriate precautions. However, that does not mean the rights of Parliament should just be tossed out, but rather it's incumbent upon us to find an appropriate balance. Even for physical security operations, which I'm sure that we can all agree are very important activities around here, that doesn't mean that Parliament's rights are expected to yield. One of your predecessors, the Honourable Member for Regina Capel, in a March 15, 2012 ruling at page 6333 of the debates, indeed made the point that, quote, the implementation of security measures cannot override the right of members to unfettered access to the parliamentary precinct, free from obstruction or interference, end quote. Earlier, I mentioned that the House itself also has rights to control its own internal affairs. Boskin Gagnon, for example, comment on page 122 that, and I quote, it is well established that by extension the House has complete and sole authority to regulate and administer its precinct without outside interference, including controlling access to the buildings. Authorities are also clear these rights may be reconciled when they conflict with members' rights to come here to represent their constituents. Indeed, that is where the balancing act that I'm suggesting comes into play. For their part, Boskin Gagnon at pages 87 and 88 note, and I quote, the individual members' rights are subordinate to those of the House as a whole. It is extremely rare, however, that the rights of the House collectively will be used to override those of an individual. End quote. Manjot adds at page 13 and 14, and I quote, while it will be seen that the member enjoys all the immunity necessary to perform his parliamentary work, this privilege or right is nevertheless subject to the practices and procedures of the House. End quote. So the real crux of the question before us, Mr. Speaker, then, is who has the proper and lawful authority to impose limits or controls on those individual rights? Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, I could offer an analogy. I'm standing here today in a suit and tie, partly because, according to the customs and usual practices of this House, I must do so in order to be recognized to speak. If I was to take my tie off, you wouldn't recognize me, and I couldn't speak. Yet I would not suggest that my rights were breached. The difference between the tie requirement in my analogy and the vaccine requirement of the board is that one is the established practice of this House, and the other was decided by some outside body and imposed on all MPs. Yep. Yes, that outside body might be composed of MPs, but it does not constitute all MPs, and therefore cannot be the House. Parliament and even judicial authorities recognize that the control of the precinct vests in the House and on its behalf the Speaker. Madam Justice Sharon, for unanimous Ontario Court of Appeal, in the 1999 Zundel v. Boudria decision, held at paragraph 18, and I quote, in my view, it should be self-evident that control over the premises occupied by the House of Commons for the purposes of performing the member's parliamentary work is a necessary adjunct to the proper functioning of Parliament. Surely, someone must be in control of the premises. Who better than the Speaker, who historically, I'm working to be as quick as I can, Mr. Speaker. The Speaker who historically has exercised this control for the House. In my view, the courts would be overstepping legitimate constitutional bounds that they sought to interfere with the power of the House to control access to its own premises, end quote. Now notice that Madam Justice Sharon referred to the House and the Speaker and not to the Board of Internal Economy and the chair of the board. And I know I'm going to be as brief as I can, Mr. Speaker, but there are a number of things that I have to address to make sure that you can properly make the ruling based on what it is not and what it is. So I will be as brief as I can. So when Mr. Speaker Milliken on May 10th of 2006 at page 1189 of the debates remarked, and I quote, "It is my role as Speaker to protect the House's control over its premises and to protect the access of members to these premises," end quote. And Mr. Speaker Reagan, in his April 6, 2017 ruling, noted at page 10246 of the debates, quote, "As Speaker, it is my role to ensure that the privileges of the House and the individual privileges of members are protected, including that of freedom from obstruction, for it is that privilege of unfettered access to the parliamentary precinct which ensures that members are able to discharge their responsibilities as elected representatives," end quote.